By now, most major economies have found a way to live with COVID-19, except for one.
The China COVID infection soaring.
Lockdowns, quarantines, business shutdowns.
WHO is very concerned over the evolving situation in China.
The wave of protests that swept across China over its draconian COVID restrictions have pushed Chinese leadership to act. The country is beginning to lift its more stringent COVID rules after nearly 3 years in isolation. But what could mark the end of zero COVID may just be the beginning of China's pandemic problems.
Crunch time starts about a month from now. Infection will be building, but the Spring Festival is the equivalent of Christmas in China. This year it starts on January 21st.
And in the next couple of weeks, China will be faced with unprecedented pressure to the health system.
You're going to see COVID zero past us. You're going to see at least this wave of COVID past us, and you're going to see a reactivation of the economy. But I think people have been way too optimistic on how fast this can happen.
Hundreds of demonstrators took to China's streets in late November after a fire erupted in an apartment building in the western city of Urumqi. Protesters blame China's strict COVID rules for hampering rescue efforts, although officials have denied those claims. The demonstrations followed months of extreme testing protocols and unpredictable lockdowns that have strained China's economy.
The protesters were outraged about the personal danger and the inhumane conditions that were being imposed under the zero COVID policy by callous bureaucrats that were not allowing people to go to the hospital, not allowing firefighters to prevent fires.
Gradually, China did not make adjustment or adaptation to the changing nature of the virus, especially the transmissibility of the virus.
In a surprising pivot, local and central governments are now starting to swiftly shed their rigid restrictions. Citizens are no longer required to provide a negative COVID test and health code check when traveling domestically. The government is also allowing more people with mild cases to quarantine at home, a departure from the massive quarantine facilities with thousands of beds.
The Chinese government wants to preserve face for the zero COVID policy. It has not renounced that policy. In name, the zero COVID policy continues. It's just like Swiss cheese. There's just so many holes in it, though. There's now becoming a whole lot of exceptions.
It is a rough time for the local people right now. You can see everyone scrambling to purchase food in advance. There's a shortage of medicine. The hospitals and the public health system are struggling to keep up with the demand.
The country is now scrambling to protect its most vulnerable citizens from a potential surge with its domestically made shots.
There are several key issues that drag China's vaccination campaign. The most important thing, I think, is the vaccination hesitancy. People have less of a trust towards its own vaccines. And secondly, there was no urgency of get vaccinated even before the Omicron can. And there's no incentive to do so because anyway, during the lockdown, the zero COVID policy, people have to get tested very frequently.
At times, Chinese authorities have moved to lock down entire cities at the center of key supply chains, weighing on the country's economic growth. The World Bank slashed its economic growth forecast for China to 2.7% in 2022, about half of the nation's target.
You're going to have the virus sweep through all of China. You have a situation right now where firms have held off for months and months and in some cases years from investing, borrowing, or hiring because they're so worried about COVID zero lockdowns going back in place.
Between companies that manufacture in China for China, they're not going anywhere. But there are also companies that are manufacturing in China for export out of China. And those are the companies that are actually looking at different locations and I think will gradually be moving.
That's not to mention international travel to China still remains extremely restricted and requires 8 days of isolation upon arrival.
If you are coming into Shanghai, you'll still be quarantined in a hotel for 5 days at least. Now, unless that is dropped, it becomes difficult for foreign investors to come in and take a look at the China market themselves.
One popular model from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation predicts that China could suffer over 1 million COVID deaths in 2023, with cases peaking in April.
What about China?
I think China's in trouble. Two things. One, they haven't lifted all mitigation. They're still implementing some mitigation. I think that's going to slow the spread but not prevent it.
So how many people are dying right now?
We don't know. I mean, much more than what they're reporting.
Much more.
The other thing with China is they have different strains circulating in different parts of that country. So in Beijing, it's BF7, which is very immunoevasive. Other parts of the country have BQ1 and BA5. So, and also XBB, which is another immunoevasive variant. So they have the potential to reinfect themselves.
And this year's Spring Festival is very early, it's combined with flu season and winter when people have more indoor activities. So I'm very concerned this may become a super spreader event.
Not to mention there are doubts that China's economy will be able to make a swift recovery even as it moves away from zero COVID.
The question is, now that COVID has broken that supply chain in certain ways, as we come back to reform the supply chain, is COVID the straw that's going to break the camel's back? I think for some companies the answer will be yes, but other companies that have the most complex supply chains, I think the answer will be no.